6 books, 1.7 million words, 90 million copies sold, 331 chapters, 45 languages, 8 seasons of TV, one man. Let's binge the entirety of A Song of Ice and Fire in 1 month. I've heard when you read A Song of Ice and Fire, you win or you die.
And now it begins.
And a huge thank you to all of our Patreons.
Thank you to the Pit Fighters, the First Swords, and all of the Bright Stars, Truth and Courage. So yeah, I've given myself the challenge of reading A Song of Ice and Fire in just 1 month. I was umming and ahhing about whether or not to even introduce this series of books. This guy here, he watches TV, he reads magazines, he knows the story of A Game of Thrones. But how does that translate to the actual books? Are they similar? Are they the same? Are they faithful adaptations? Now, I am a book lover. I'm a fantasy lover. It's true. So I'm going to try and persuade this guy to read the books rather than just watch the show. A caveat before we dive in. I love fantasy. I love it so much. From Tolkien to Abercrombie to M.L. Wang to Robin Hobb. I love fantasy. I mean, my dad is the writer John Gwynne, so if I didn't love it, I probably would have been cast out from the family, which would not have been ideal. I read, I review, I'm a booktuber first and foremost with my brother Will, and I know any man who must say I am a booktuber is no true booktuber. I've always been a huge fan of the TV show, and I've dabbled with the books, but I really miss those days of binging a series as I did when I was a kid. I would fall in love, I would dive in from head to toe into this immersive world. I would be captured for a month, for maybe 2, and then I'd move on to another series and then kind of feel that love. And I really miss having that kind of magical experience of losing yourself in immersion. So I thought, you know, what series is at the top of my list to really kind of read back to back, dive in wholeheartedly, and it had to be A Song of Ice and Fire. I've kind of been desperate to consume it obsessively. I'm ready for the obsessiveness. In the words of Aerys Targaryen, I'm going to burn through them all. Let's dive in. And now my watch begins. Okay, the scene is set. I wanted to kind of warm up, pardon the pun, before I got into the thick of it. So, what do we say to the god of reading? Fine, I'll read them all. Let's talk about A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. So here we have 3 novellas set about 100 years prior to the events that start in A Game of Thrones. We meet Duncan the Tall, aka Dunk. I think George R. R. Martin was obviously a Brighton fan. Dunk the Lunk as thick as a castle wall, a recently knighted knight who desperately needs to make his living and egg his newly acquired squire. There are tourneys, knights and drowning men, horses, pageantry, lances, snails, petty nobles and gossip. There is plenty of drama across the 3 stories. The mileage may vary for some. This is a great addition to have, I think, if you're a hardcore Song of Ice and Fire fan. The illustrations were beautiful, and seeing a bit more of the world of Westeros was really fascinating to me. The tone is certainly lighter to anything else in the world of A Song of Ice and Fire. It's full of history. The world building is very Martin deep, George R. R. Martin-esque. The characters grow with depth. There are dynamic relationships. So I really enjoyed it for the most part. What kind of detracts, I think, from these stories is the variety, which you can't quite have in novellas, but they weren't that typical bold storytelling, bold prose even, that the tales of A Song of Ice and Fire, the other books, are and have. That's kind of in their DNA. So it felt like a little bit was missing here. It can get a little bit repetitive. There's lots of travelling, lots of, knighthood pageantry and tourneys. So if you kind of are a big fan of the 15th century, if you love knighthood and, Dan Jones books, as well as any of that 100 Years' War period, then I think, you'd kind of enjoy the world building here. We know that Westeros is very much inspired by medieval Europe, but this leans very heavily into the kind of historicalness of medieval Europe. So Dunk is a travelling knight. He serves no liege lord, so there's lots of tourneys, aplenty, hedge knights and princes, banners and knights, cap-a-pierre, lords and disputes. It's certainly fun, which is not something I would say about the books that follow this. So, let's get into the big guns.
Oh my God! Okay, it's happening. Everybody stay calm.
What's the
Everybody
procedure,
stay calm.
everyone? What's the procedure?
Stay calm.
Wait.
Everybody calm down.
A Game of Thrones. Immediately, you know this one is different. It has kind of a real intent behind the writing, real purpose. This has careful prose, bold prose, exciting prose. Such intensity, total immersion, dialogue sharper than an obsidian spear, and a world that grabbed me and forced me to be invested. And that is just the prologue. We're thrown into a world that is so alive, it feels like it's breathing. It focuses on family, especially at the beginning, in a very intimate setting, but slowly branches outwards as the core of the family is split down the middle. Now, of course, we've all heard of Game of Thrones, we've all heard of A Song of Ice and Fire, but I am really surprised at how much I absolutely adored this. I mean, we know that Gurm is such a talented writer that obviously Game of Thrones captured the world by storm, really, but meeting the cast in the first, dozen or so chapters, you immediately know that you're reading a masterpiece. What I love here is the histories that are mentioned, how they're referenced through the characters, through lore and the world building, and how different characters have different experiences of the same events. In other words, an unreliable narrator. I find that style of writing, that style of storytelling really fascinating. And I just knew within the first, 12, 15 chapters that I was reading something that I was going to absolutely love. And I really missed that feeling. So Game of Thrones has such a great balance with mystery, times of mystery and moments of kind of bluntness, with POV characters conveying their extreme discomfort most of the time about the situations that they are in. Now, George R. R. Martin is a craftsman here and a master at that. The pacing, compared to a contemporary fantasy novel, can be slow, but slow is not a dirty word in my book. When the payoffs are as sweet as they are in a Game of Thrones, you can be as slow as you like. But I may be eating my words about the later books. In short, I loved A Game of Thrones. I loved my time with it. There's more drama in these pages than an entire season of The Housewives of New Jersey.
I said what I said,
As
and
always.
I'm not changing on it, okay? I said what I said. It ain't changing over here.
And it's kind of the point that I realised I was falling for Westeros. You've got incredible characters like Ned Stark, Jon Snow. You have some incredible set pieces as well that are not only action, but they are also dialogue, and they are moments where characters kind of intersect POV-wise, and I absolutely love that. And I think George R. R. Martin set out to kind of subvert a lot of things about fantasy and shock the readers, and he definitely did that at the end of book 1. I think everyone knows at this point that they're reading something that is, treading its own path, walking down its own road, and to read something that feels fresh, but also it feels like it has a kindred spirit to, classic fantasy works. Then that kind of feels like, as a fantasy reader, I'm coming home, but, home is not as it used to be. A Clash of Kings. This has layers. It's like Shrek. It's like Sherdavash. We are established in these lands. However, George R. R. Martin wastes very little time in throwing our characters into, again, life-altering situations. A Game of Thrones is famous for its politicking, but A Clash of Kings is truly where the Machiavellian intrigue comes into play. Cicero would be proud of Tyrion here, who is the real MVP of the novel. He probably has the most addictive chapters in kind of maybe any fantasy novel that I've ever read. Everything with Tyrion kind of left me with a wry smile on my face, with a stone of tension in my gut, and at the end of the day, that's why I read. I read to feel things, even if it does give me stomach issues. I think you can tell that Martin absolutely loves Tyrion, especially in this book. Going by that, maybe he doesn't love Daenerys as much, but she does get a hard rap, I think, a lot of the time. But I feel like it actually is warranted in A Clash of Kings. She's not exactly the most exciting POV, which is frustrating because she's kind of someone who has so much potential. But she is that constant reminder to the reader that the Iron Throne has a contender. Game of Thrones is good, but this is different gravy. It's a different kettle of fish. So many compelling characters, both POVs and not. The pacing is actually perfect. Peaks that hit such heights. Stan the Man, the way that Martin writes warfare, the way he writes heartbreak and grief in its various forms, all hits home for me. This is over 1,000 pages and there was hardly a dull moment. George R. R. Martin's writing is indeed addictive. It shines. He can info dump, especially when he kind of introduces a new character. Do we need to know exactly what shade of brown their hair is? Do we need to know what exact shade of green their dress is in King's Landing? Do we need to know who their second cousin's golf partners were? Not really, but it sure does add to the immersion when the rest of the moments are pure fire. More on that later. The book towards the end does have some POV chapters creeping in where I felt a bit meh. I'm sure that won't continue, but it's still a fantastic book. There are some of probably the highest of highs here in fantasy, in any literature really, because I think Martin has successfully got me so incredibly invested, and it is really groundbreaking stuff. The Storm of Swords is so intense, so I think I'm going to need to hang out with the sheep for this one, just to calm me down. Okay, I know that I'm not really saying anything groundbreaking here, but this might be the greatest work of fantasy of all time. This probably is the fantasy masterpiece, not written by Papa Gwyn, of course. I can't say much about this book that hasn't been said much more eloquently already, but what I do love about this book and the series thus far are the stakes. They are rare, they're medium done, they're well done. No, I'm joking. The stakes mean that the reader has such a deep understanding, a personal connection, rooted feelings regarding the characters. And for me, I'm a character reader. That is the kind of most important element of a story for me. If I love a character, I don't really mind what they're getting up to as long as I'm with them and as long as they are being true to themselves. And the characters in Song of Ice and Fire so far, their motivations, their desires, we know them so well. We know what will kind of elevate their goals, what will crush them, and you do feel the weight of all of their decisions. You feel whether it's a small ripple effect of dialogue, or a wedding, or a battle, or a threat, idle or not, every single thing counts, everything matters, and for that reason you are utterly invested. And I don't know how, but you can somehow root for 80% of the characters, 80% of the cast, when they're all against each other. They all have completely different motivations. George R. R. Martin has a way of making you feel invested in every single POV. They are just that compelling, which I think is such a monumental feat of an author. This is the kind of book that you read and you feel like it's a reward.
It's like a reward.
To read a page, a word, it becomes this desire, this need to kind of simply consume the story. A lot of promises have been made in A Song of Ice and Fire thus far, and most of them are fulfilled here. Sometimes in a way that is unpredictable, sometimes in a way that is painful.
Life is pain, Highness.
And as a story, it does peak a few times. Most, I think, books would say peak once. They're kind of Mount Everest, and then it all drops down, and that's part of storytelling, story beats. This series, this book in particular, peaks several times. It is a mountain range, it is the Himalayas, and these moments are as iconic in fantasy as Gandalf facing off against the Balrog. And they're not always set pieces or action. Sometimes it's dialogue, sometimes it's a council scene, sometimes it's a sharp reveal that even feels like a crescendo, easily hitting the heights of satisfaction of kind of a traditional fantasy novel. He agrees. I think Jaime is widely regarded as probably the best character in A Storm of Swords. For me, I do love his arc. He's one of my favourite characters in all of fantasy now. I think Catelyn probably hits a little bit harder for me. Her grief, her heartache, her decisions that are all fed into protecting her children, keeping her family safe, they all hit really hard for me, and I think she's just written to perfection. She probably has some of the most memorable lines and scenes in all of fantasy for me as well. She's an absolute just force of nature, and I always love it when I see her name. And that is what I love about POV, multi-POV stories, where
you'll read a chapter, usually will end on a cliffhanger, knowing George R. R. Martin. Then you see another character's name, you're like, no, I want to get back to this person. But then within a couple of pages, you are easily engulfed in their personality, in their desires, what's going on in their section of the world. And then, it's just a fantastic chessboard, and I absolutely love it. I can't help but compare this book to season 3 and 4 of the show. Whilst I do think that this book is better than season 3, I think season 4 of the show does a better job of Tyrion's segments, and specifically Oberyn Martell in the show, I think, than in the book. I do prefer how it's done there. This is still an amazing book. I think, me saying a part of the show is better than the book, this is probably where the sacrilege of me saying that will end from now on.
I think the majority of A Song of Ice and Fire readers will now say that we've reached the peak and it goes downhill from here. And whilst I do agree that we are moving at a decline, I don't think it's as sharp as that hill where people chase cheese. It's a leisurely stroll, not a massive drop. A Feast for Crows gets a lot of hate, but I ate this book up like it was potato salad. How could a book have the audacity to try and even follow on from the heights of A Storm of Swords? It had to move differently to pull the sheepskin from beneath our feet, and it certainly did. So yeah, this book was kind of split by location based on the characters. So some of the characters are in this book, some of the characters are in Dance, the ones that aren't in Dance are in this, the ones that aren't in this are in Dance, and vice versa. Whilst I do disagree with that choice, it is still fire, I think. We do miss characters like Jon, Tyrion, Daenerys, but I think the strength of Jaime shines through, the smattering of alternative POVs like the goings-on in the Iron Islands gear the reader up for what you want to feel: tension, stakes, investment, immersion. Seeing the way Jaime has changed, the way Cersei is falling deeper into her pit, is written so well, and that finale really blew my mind. Apart from Sam needs to go from 5'10" to 5'2".
Off with his head!
And I think reading A Feast for Crows is the moment that I realised in my binging journey that me binging this series has made me probably enjoy this book more than if I had spaced it out months apart or even years. The stakes do lessen, I think the politics are less honed, but there's still magic between the pages of A Feast for Crows, and I was very excited to dive into A Dance with Dragons, but I did have a tinge of fear and also sadness that this is probably the last of my journey of A Song of Ice and Fire, at least for a little while. On to A Dance with Dragons. Let's see if the future is dark and full of terrors.
If you think this has a happy ending, you haven't been paying attention. We're at the final instalment that we have. Are you kidding me? We've climbed the mountain, and don't forget, peak rhymes with seek. And are we seeking the glory of the earlier days? Yes and no. We've come a long way since Eddard in the halls of Winterfell, since Tyrion pissing off of the wall, since the promises of the direwolf pups. Everything has changed so much, and I can't help but feel this bitter, nostalgic pain in my heart at how Westeros has changed. How characters have died, have failed, and any story that can make me feel that way is a story worth reading, a story worth latching onto, finished or not. So if you're someone who says that they know how, they know all about the story of A Game of Thrones, they've seen the TV show, there is so much more in these pages. There is so much extra things that you can feel past that visual medium of watching something on the screen. There's and after me binging this for an entire month, it's actually one of my favourite reading memories I think I've ever had. This whole month I will always remember. September, the month that I actually got married, is the month of also A Song of Ice and Fire, where I threw my whole life really into binging this series, and it has been remarkable. Here we do discover that Cersei is the Michael Scott of King's Landing.
I underestimated you.
Yeah, well, maybe next time you will estimate me.
Here we discover the ferocity of Barristan the Bold. We discover how many things rhyme with reek. We discover the genius of John Conn. The writing at fundamental level, the prose style is still George's classic structure. His dialogue and immersion is top tier. The only thing that has changed with A Dance of Dragons is the most of the cast, really. And also the goalposts, and some of these changes are incredible. Some can weigh down the ship. Do wish that I pieced this together with Feast, that I read the chapters, chronologically, because it is strange going then into Dance after having all the happenings of A Feast for Crows. You're left on a cliffhanger, and there are promises that are set up in Feast that are not fulfilled here because of the way that you have to then go back chronologically to the different areas of Westeros, the different areas of the Seven Kingdoms, and more. So yeah, it feels like the promises are just kind of extended, which is not what I think readers are after. Reflecting on how the books, the characters, even the world has changed from the early days. Was this really George's original vision? I can't answer that, but I do know that I have had a great time. So I did it. I read the entirety of A Song of Ice and Fire in a single month, and I think my kind of takeaways, if I look at the series as a whole, that what I love about George's writing is that he adds this humanity, the grit, the realism to altogether an unrealistic world. The social landscapes are explored, though mostly from those kind of higher up in the echelons of society. I do wish that we had some more POVs from the free folk, from people lower down in the tiers of society. The ages of the cast at the beginning of the series are kind of odd, lots of young teenagers, and it does feel a bit strange, especially how adult and intense the world is. I know George was going for that kind of European medieval style influence, which of course, look at Edward the Black Prince, was, a warrior at 14 and led battles at 16 and whatnot. But I think that should be the exception, and there's a lot of uncomfortable reading in these pages. And, sometimes age does play a part in that. The history of the technology at times can feel pretty stagnant. The Targaryens used as some otherworldly message of gluttony and terror and indulgence. We know that history is important, especially specifically to us, to learn from mistakes. However, I think the history in A Song of Ice and Fire, it does add intrigue and this element to the world building, but it does make the world seem as if it's been standing still for quite some time. What I do respect most with George's writing is the way that he is not afraid to kind of sow seeds, to build up to things, to set things up, to allow the reader to slowly become immersed and invested, even in minor characters like the great John Umbar. And when shit goes down with literally any member of the cast, the impact because of that is huge. I think many authors are kind of in a rush to let their surprises, let their secrets spill out. People aren't very good at withholding gossip, But I do think maybe that's because of publishing, traditional publishing, a lack of freedom, the need to keep readers engaged and hooked, whether it's through promises that don't feel impactful. But I think George does it so well where you can hang on to secrets for quite literally thousands of pages at a time, and it has such a huge impact because of that. Treat them mean, keep them keen, I think. And another thing I love about Song of Ice and Fire are the names. Hardhome, the Sword of the Morning, the Mountain That Rides, Baylor, Breakspear, the Dreadfort. I just absolutely love the naming conventions of that, and whenever I hear a name from a Song of Ice and Fire, I know where it's from. I know if it's from Westeros or another continent. I know what kind of faction from Westeros it will be. It's got that individuality to it. And I think George's subversion of tropes, look at the evil uncle as Stannis, Prince Charming as Joffrey, the rightful heir as Viserys. I think the way that he subverts those tropes, it makes fantasy feel like it's at home, but it's really fun to kind of play around with those tropes. And I don't think trope, again, is a dirty word, which a lot of people do, but I do think it's healthy to subvert them and sometimes to not subvert them. I think George is very focused on new spins, new twists, on shocks, on subversions, that maybe we need something that isn't subverted in one of his works. Maybe I'm missing an example, but I'm sure you guys in the comments can let me know. So as I close these final pages of A Dance of Dragons, should I feel hope for what is to come? Should I feel bitter? Who knows? But I do know that my time with A Song of Ice and Fire is worth every second, I hope, for Winds of Winter. I have a tender spot in my heart for slaughtered heroes, gut punches, and enough murder to make Tarantino seem tame. That was my A Song of Ice and Fire journey. Let me know in the comments below if you'd like to see me binge another author. Until next time, stay safe. Truth and courage, the Brother Gwyn.
And a huge thank you to all of our Patreons.
Thank you to the Pit Fighters, the First Swords, and all of the Bright Stars. Truth and courage.